Greetings, Vault Dwellers.
Hello, everyone.
Today we're going to teach you how to play Magic the Gathering.
But with Fallout.
Some of you might have played Magic the Gathering before, some of you might still play Magic the Gathering now, but a lot of you have just discovered that Magic the Gathering exists with the new Fallout MTG decks.
We are always looking for fun new ways to play Fallout, and Magic the Gathering is an excellent way to do so.
Magic the Gathering has been around for decades. There are thousands of cards from dozens of sets, and the rules can be daunting if you're just starting out.
Magic represents an ongoing battle between wizards who cast spells and summon creatures to attack their opponents and bring their life down to 0, thus winning the game.
There are several game formats, with the two most common being Standard and Commander. Standard uses a 60-card deck pulled from the current sets of Magic the Gathering. You can have no more than 4 copies of any card, you're usually playing one-on-one with a single opponent, and your life counter starts at 20.
Commander uses a 100-card deck from any set using any card that isn't specifically banned for being too powerful. You can't have more than 1 copy of any card. Decks are usually built around one single card called the Commander. The game can be played with up to 4 players, and life counters start at 40. This is the most popular format for recreational play, and it's what we're going to teach you today.
First, some basic concepts. What you see before you is the board. Here you have a number of areas: the deck, the battlefield, the graveyard, the commander zone, and an invisible zone called exile.
There are 2 types of cards, land and spells.
Lands produce a resource called mana.
They do so by tapping, which is represented by turning the card sideways.
Mana can be one of 5 colors, or a 6th type of mana that's known as colorless mana. It's not meant to confuse you, it's just the way it is. Here are 5 basic lands. These represent the 5 colors. Mountain makes red, plains makes white, forest makes green, island makes blue, and swamp makes black. Non-basic lands can make colored or colorless mana depending on what their ability is and what it says in their text.
Decks are built around 1, 2, or sometimes 3 colors of mana.
Cards for a color follow the theme of that color. Red cards represent the fiery heart of emotion, things like destruction and burning and wrath.
White represents order and structure, like healing, angels, soldiers, and biblical wrath.
Blue represents science and progress. These decks use small creatures and alteration spells, and are often known as control decks because they can control the battlefield by disrupting what the opponents are trying to do.
Black is for death and destruction, but not necessarily evil. It's more about ambition without concern for cost.
Green represents growth and powerful force. These cards symbolize wisdom, ancient forces, and often use massive creatures.
Spells cost mana to cast. In this case, I'm going to tap for 1 red mana and 1 white mana, which allows me to bring out my Loyal Apprentice.
Cards are either permanent or non-permanent. A permanent is anything that stays on the battlefield after being cast. Those cards are land, creatures, an artifact, an enchantment, or 2 others that we won't use here, which are planeswalkers and battles. A non-permanent is anything that leaves the battlefield after being cast, which is either a sorcery or an instant.
Cards can also have super types, subtypes, and often have race or class as well. For example, a legendary creature, human soldier. Artifact creature. Artifact equipment. Enchantment aura. These extra parameters come into play with other spells that target or boost a specific subclass of a card type.
One of the things that's unique about Magic is the use of the word may. When a card has an ability and it says that something may happen, the person who played the card can decide if it happens or not. But if it has an ability that doesn't use the word may, such as my impassioned orator here who says, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life, it's not optional.
When creatures first appear on the battlefield, they have summoning sickness. This applies only to creatures. They literally get sick and they need an entire turn to rest before they can attack. This means that you can't tap your creatures until the next turn. Abilities that don't require tapping can still be used.
Let's explore a card in detail. This card is the Wise Mothman. He has a mana cost of 1 blue, 1 green, 1 black, and 1 mana of any color or colorless mana. He is a legendary creature and an insect mutant. That represents his type, subtype, race, and class. He has a power of 3 and a toughness of 3. His abilities include flying. Whenever the Wise Mothman enters the battlefield or attacks, each player gets a rad counter. Whenever one or more non-land cards are milled, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to X target creatures, where X is the number of non-land cards milled this way.
Some cards have activated abilities. For instance, Raoul, Troubleshooter. Raoul's mana cost is 1 black, 1 blue, and 1 of any color or colorless. He's a legendary creature, zombie mutant rogue. That is his type, subtype, race, and class. He has a power of 1 and a toughness of 4. His abilities are: once during each of your turns, you may cast a spell from among cards in your graveyard that were milled this turn. Tap, each player mills a card.
Raoul is an interesting card. His abilities are powerful, which is compensated by his low power and high toughness. One of his abilities is activated and requires tapping, which means that it can only be used if he hasn't already been tapped, or if it has been activated, he can't be tapped for anything else like combat. His other ability, however, does not require tapping, so you can use that ability anytime after Raoul enters the battlefield. Milling is what's known as a game mechanic. There are dozens of game mechanics in Magic the Gathering. If you encounter anything that you don't understand or haven't seen before, use the Magic the Gathering Wiki for information about how it works and how to use it. Let's jump into the most exciting part of a Magic the Gathering game, which is creature combat. Remember that creatures have both power and toughness. If a creature's toughness goes to 0, the creature dies and is placed in the graveyard. Creatures can only attack opponents, and an opponent is either another player or a planeswalker. To declare that a creature is attacking, tap it. The defending player may use a creature to block, but they don't have to. If they do, the defending player declares blockers. Only untapped creatures can block. Damage is assigned at the same time. In this case, Loyal Apprentice deals 2 points of damage to Impassioned Orator, and Impassioned Orator deals 2 points of damage to Loyal Apprentice. Both of them now have toughness of 0 or less, and so they both go to the graveyard. Excess damage does not spill over to an opponent unless the attacking creature has an ability that says it does. Abilities that affect combat include things like Death Touch, Trample, Lifelink, First Strike, Double Strike, and others.
It's also possible to block with multiple creatures. Imagine if our battlefield looked like this. I'm going to attack Oscapt with Synth Eradicator.
I'm going to choose to defend. Synth Eradicator has 3 points of power and 3 points of toughness. McCready Lamplight Mare only has 1 point of power, and Securiton Squadron has 2 points of power. If I were to block with only one or the other, my creature would die, but Synth Eradicator would not. So I'm going to choose to block with both of them.
But I get to choose how damage is done.
Remember that all damage is dealt simultaneously, but when blocking with multiple creatures, all damage has to be done to the first creature before any excess damage passes to the second creature. In this case, Noodle chose to put McCready Lamplight Mare first so that she can kill it because it has better attributes than Securiton Squadron, and she wants it off the field. McCready Lamplight Mare takes 3 points of damage and dies. Securiton Squadron takes no points of damage and lives, but McCready Lamplight Mare and Securiton Squadron deal a collective 3 points of damage to Synth Eradicator, who also dies. The dead creatures leave the battlefield, and we're left with Securiton Squadron. Understanding creature combat, let's go through a game from the beginning showing all the parts. The first thing that you're going to need, obviously, is a deck. You'll also need some stuff that you can use as counters. These can be 20-sided dice, which are often given as life counters. They could be little tchotchkes that you can use to put on things, or they can even be fancy things that you print out or draw. You'll also need some tokens for whatever game you're playing. For example, these are junk tokens, and most decks include various types of tokens that you can use for the deck. If you ever don't have a token, you can just cut out a piece of paper and write whatever the object is on it according to the text that's on the card. The last thing that you'll need is something you can use to keep track of your life. These are the life counters that came with the Fallout decks, but if you don't have something fancy like this, you can also just use a piece of paper with a number that you write on. One of the special things about Commander is that it's possible to win the game if your commander deals 21 points of damage to your opponent. So in addition to keeping track of your own life, you'll also need some way to keep track of the amount of damage your commander does to each other opponent. Each player's turn has multiple phases, starting with the beginning phase, moving into first main phase, the combat phase, second main phase, and finally the ending phase. We'll go through each of them as appropriate and talk about the steps that are involved in each one. Now, Noodle and I have already rolled a die, and she won, but she decided that I will go first, which means as the starting player, I do not draw a card. Ordinarily, in the beginning phase, you untap any permanents you have on the board. You do any upkeep, maintenance tasks, moving counters around, anything that happens to happen during the upkeep portion of the beginning phase, and then you draw. After drawing, new to Fallout, you resolve any rad counters that are on the board, and if you don't have any, you move on to the first main phase. During the first main phase, you can play a land, but only one land can be played per turn unless a card's text allows you to play more than one. Once you have land that you can tap for mana, you can cast spells. This is Command Tower, which allows me to tap to add 1 mana of any color in my commander's color identity. My commander, who's sitting off board in the command zone, is the Wise Mothman, who is blue, green, and black. That's his color identity. So I can tap this for any one of those colors. This is a fantastic card. I'm going to tap for 1 green mana and play Soul Ring. Soul Ring is an artifact. I can tap it to add 2 colorless mana. This is called mana acceleration. On turn 1, usually you have 1 mana because you can only play 1 land. Turn 2, you have 2 mana, and so on. But on my turn 2, in fact, even right now, I could tap it for 2 colorless mana. There's no reason to do that because I don't have anything in my hand that I can play, nor do I have any creatures that we can do combat with. So I'm going to move from first main phase to combat, nothing happens, to second main phase, which is like the first main phase. You can do all the same stuff, play a land if you haven't already played one, play more creatures, do whatever else, and then finally go on to the end phase where you do any final stuff and then pass the turn.
On my turn, I don't have any land out, so I have nothing to untap. I have nothing for upkeep. I just draw a card. I drew a land, and I will play this land right away. Land doesn't have summoning sickness, so I can use its ability right away as well. I will tap it to play an artifact. This is Bloodforged Battle Axe, artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+0. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, create a token that's a copy of Bloodforged Battle Axe. It costs 2 to equip. I can do nothing else on my turn, so I pass it on to Oscar.
I start the beginning phase by untapping, no upkeep, no rad counters, so I'll draw. In my first main phase, I will play a forest, and I'll then tap everything for 1 green, 1 green, and 2 colorless, which I'll use to play Cathedral Acolyte and Hardened Scales. Cathedral Acolyte says each creature you control with a counter on it has Ward 1, which means whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability that an opponent controls, counter it unless that player pays 1 mana extra. I can also tap Cathedral Acolyte to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature that entered the battlefield this turn. I can't do that this turn because Cathedral Acolyte is a creature and has summoning sickness. Hardened Scales is an enchantment. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, that many +1/+1/+1 counters are put on it instead. This means if I'm going to put a counter onto a creature, I actually put 2. If I'm going to put 5 counters, I put 6. All my lands are tapped. My creature has summoning sickness. We skip through combat, nothing happens. Second main phase, nothing happens. End step, pass the turn.
Untap. Upkeep. Draw. I play another land, and now I can use both of my lands, tap tap, to play a creature, Pure Steel Paladin. It has Metalcraft. Equipment you control have equip 0 as long as you control 3 or more artifacts. He is a creature, so he has Summoning Sickness. He cannot attack this turn.
We're going to start going through these things a little bit faster. Untap, upkeep, draw. I will play Hinterland Harbor. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a forest or an island. I control a forest, so it does not enter tapped, and I can use it right away. I'll tap it for 1 blue mana, 1 green mana, 1 black mana, and 2 colorless mana to bring in the Wise Mothman. Mothman has 3 abilities. Flying. Whenever the Wise Mothman enters the battlefield or attacks, each player gets a rad counter. And whenever 1 or more non-land cards are milled, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to X target creatures, where X is the number of non-land cards milled this way. We talked about milling earlier in the video. It's a mechanic where cards go from your deck to your graveyard, and then things happen. I'll tap Cathedral Acolyte to put a +1/+1 counter on the Wise Mothman, but then I will use Hardened Scales ability to actually make that 2 +1/+1 counters. Since the only creature I can attack with is tapped, we can skip combat. I have no more lands, so skip second main phase, and go.
Untap, upkeep, draw. Let's resolve the rad counter.
To resolve a rad counter, at the beginning of your pre-combat phase, if you have any rad counters, mill that many cards. For each non-land card milled this way, you lose 1 life and a rad counter.
Mill 1 card. It is an enchantment aura, not a land. So rad counter goes away, and I lose 1 life.
This triggers Mothman's ability, and I want to keep Cathedral Acolyte alive. So I'm going to add a +1/+1 counter, and then a second one because of Hardened Scales. I do this even though it's not my turn, because the ability of my card triggered on Noodle's turn.
It is still my turn, so I can play a land. I can tap this land and white and play Junk Jet. Junk Jet is an artifact. When Junk Jet enters the battlefield, create a junk token. You can pay 3, sacrifice another artifact, double equipped creature's power until end of turn. This activates Pure Steel Paladin's ability, which allows me to draw a card. Now, I could attack with my Paladin, but I know that Oscap can block with a Mothman who is much larger, and he can kill this card. And I still have plans for him, so I will not attack. Go.
Untap. Upkeep. Draw. Resolve the rad counter. I milled a non-land card. Lose the rad counter. Lose 1 life. But now, Mothman gains 2 +1/+1 counters. I'll start out by playing a swamp, and then I will attack with Mothman. Remember from creature combat that I declare an attacker by tapping it, and at that point, Noodle can declare blockers. However, Mothman's ability triggers, which says that everyone gets a rad counter. Mothman has flying, which means that it can only be blocked by other creatures with flying or with an ability called reach.
I don't have anything that has flying or reach, so I have to take the damage.
Mothman hits Noodle for 7 points of damage. With combat now over, we enter my second main phase, and although I have a bunch of land that I can tap for mana, I don't have anything in my hand that I can play. So I skip through second main phase, end phase, pass the turn.
Untap, upkeep, draw, resolve the rad counter. Mill 1 card. It is a land, so nothing happens. I will play a land because I can. And now I can equip both of my artifacts to the Paladin for free using his ability because I have 3 artifacts out.
Noodle's Paladin is now 4/2 with an ability of pay 3 mana and sacrifice another artifact to double equip creature's power until end of turn.
And I could have done that last turn, but I didn't. And now I will pay white, red, green to bring in my commander, Dogmeat. When Dogmeat enters the battlefield, mill 5 cards, then return an aura or equipment card from your graveyard to your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I will keep Idolized.
Noodle milled 3 cards that were non-land, so I can now put a +1/+1 counter on each of 3 creatures that I control. I only control 2 creatures, so Mothman will get 1, plus a second one for Hardened Scales, and my Cathedral Acolyte will also get 2.
I was going to attack with my Paladin so that I can trigger Dogmeat's ability to produce junk tokens, and also so that I can deal some damage to my opponent, or possibly took out some of his blockers. But literally on this turn, that creature got bigger, and if it were to block the Paladin, it would kill it. So I don't attack. Your turn.
Untap, upkeep, draw, resolve the rad counter, land card, nothing happens. Tap a swamp, forest, and a hinterland harbor to play Raoul, Troubleshooter. Once during each of your turns, you may cast a spell from among cards in your graveyard that were milled this turn. He has a tapping ability that says each player mills a card, but because he has Summoning Sickness, he can't tap. I would love to pull Branching Evolution out of my graveyard, but that was not milled this turn. But I will tap Cathedral Acolyte to put a +1/+1 counter on Raoul, and then double it because of Hardened Scales. Here endeth my first main phase. Moving into combat, I will declare an attacker. Do you declare blockers?
I do not. I still have nothing with flying or reach.
Mothman flies over all of Noodle's creatures and deals 9 points of damage.
But not before he also graces us with some rad counters. Now I will take the 9 points of damage. Untap, upkeep, draw, resolve rad counters. There are now 2, so mill 2 cards. Land, land, nothing happens. I will play land, and I will pay 2 mana of any color plus a white to cast Pre-War Formalware, which is an artifact equipment. When Pre-War Formalware enters the battlefield, return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield and attach Pre-War Formalware to it. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has Vigilance. I will bring back Brotherhood Outcast, which now has +2/+2 and Vigilance. When Brotherhood Outcast enters the battlefield, choose 1. Return target aura equipment card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, or put a shield counter on target creature. I choose 1, and I will bring back Fire Shrieker, which is also an artifact equipment. Equipped creature has double strike, costs 2 to equip, but because I have more than 3 artifacts out on the field, I can use Paladin's ability of Metalcraft and equip it for free. So now my creatures are a little bit bigger. I'm thinking of attacking, but I'm going to pass again. Your turn.
Untap. Draw. Resolve rad counters. Land. Land. Nothing happens. I will play a land, and then I will tap everything for 7 mana to play Agent Frank Horrigan. He has Trample, which means that any excess damage that he deals to a blocker gets passed through to the opponent. He also has Indestructible as long as he attacked this turn, and whenever Agent Frank Horrigan enters the battlefield or attacks, proliferate twice. To proliferate, choose any number of permanents and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give another rad counter to Noodle.
No.
Then I'm going to take each of my creatures and I'm going to give them an extra counter. And then that gets an extra counter from Hardened Scales. And then I'm going to give them another extra counter ×2. And with just that one card, I'm ready to unleash some serious damage. I will attack with the Wise Mothman for 13 points of damage. Now, he has already done 16 points of damage to her, which means that if he deals 5 more, that's 21, and I win the game.
I still don't have anything with flying to block him with. However,
However,
in response to your attack, I will play an instant.
uh-oh.
I will pay 1 white mana, and that guy requires me to pay an extra. I happen to have an extra to play Path to Exile.
That is an instant. An instant is a spell that can be played at any time in response to anything at all. Exile target creature. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. Commanders are special. When a commander would be exiled, put into a graveyard, or returned to its owner's hand, the owner may decide to place it into the command zone instead, which is what I just did. As the second part of that, I'll search my library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle my deck. With large decks, it helps to have a shuffler, or if your cards are in sleeves, it makes it a lot easier. I tapped everything, so there's nothing else I can do this turn. Noodle and I would go back and forth like this until one of us had 0 life, or until one of our commanders had dealt 21 points of damage to the other, at which point that person would lose the game. This gives you an idea of what's involved in starting a game and playing through each of the turns, and you can see that the game gets crazy complicated, crazy quick, but all you have to do is pay attention to what everything says, follow those steps, and you'll be just fine. Remember, you're a wizard, so you must be able to cast spells that do more than summon creatures, and in fact, you just saw Noodle do that.
2 other card types represent spells that aren't permanents. They're sorcery and instant.
The only difference between a sorcery and an instant is when they can be cast. As you just saw, an instant can be cast at any time, even when it's not your turn, as long as you have the mana to pay for it. A sorcery, on the other hand, can only be played in one of your 2 main phases on your own turn. Some cards have abilities that say activate only as a sorcery, which means it can only be activated at a time where you could cast a sorcery. Tapping abilities behave kind of like instants, in that if you have a creature that has a tapping ability, you can also do that in response to anything at any time.
You have enough now to get started playing any format of Magic the Gathering. But let's go through the extra rules of Commander.
When you're playing the Commander format, your commander must be a legendary creature.
You now have 40 life on your counter.
Playing Commander introduces a new zone called the Command Zone, where your commander starts and where it may return if it is exiled or sent to a graveyard by any means.
The Commander cost increases every time that you need to bring him back from the Commander Zone.
If we look at the Wise Mothman, who takes 1 blue, 1 green, 1 black, and 1 mana of any color or colorless, the first time that he's cast, you only need that mana. If he gets exiled or sent to a graveyard and returns to the command zone, the next time he costs 2 additional mana of any color. If he gets sent off the battlefield again, the next time he costs 4 additional mana of any color. And this continues for every time that you wish to cast your commander from the command zone.
This is just the tip of the iceberg of how to play Magic. But it's enough to get you started and make sure that you're able to have fun while you keep learning.
If you live in a major city, there will be a store that sells Magic the Gathering merchandise, and they will have regular events. Casual play, tournaments, Friday Night Magic. There are tons of opportunities for you to get together with other people, learn more about how to play, and play against all different kinds of decks and styles.
You can also follow the affiliate links in our video description below to grab your own Fallout decks on Amazon and play with a friend at home. And that way you don't have to leave the house at all.
Like us. We never leave the house. We described the colors earlier. Which one of those resonated with you? Use this to pick a new Fallout 76 Commander deck. Scrappy Survivors is red, green, and white.
Science is blue, red, and white.
Hail Caesar is red, white, and black.
And Mutant Menace is black, green, and blue.
Each of these decks has unique strengths and weaknesses. In other videos, we go through the strategies of the deck and how to use its cards most effectively.
Let us know in the comments how you like the new decks, and welcome to the MTG Fallout family. We are Gamer Aviator.
And until next time, play more Magic, and stay safe out there, Vault Dwellers.